welcome to the last round of the ground check discussion of the German Archaeological Institute. 5 rounds have already been dealt with. We looked back into the past. We looked at the impact of climate change on early societies and cultures. We talked about the risk and hazards of the rise of sea levels or the thawing of permafrost for precious cultural heritage goods. And now we have the last rounds where we want to take a view into the future and look ahead and talk to politicians and with them on their views of climate change and the impact on early or contemporary societies. However, there is still an important vote going on in the federal parliament, so that we have to reorganize our agenda. The politicians will only join us by 7 p.m., 19 hours. But we already have Michael Müntefering with us. She is the State Minister for International Cultural Policy and is working at the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which supports a number of projects of the German Archaeological Institute, for example, the Archaeological Heritage Network, which again has made it possible to hold our ground check conferences. Mrs. Müntefering, you have the floor. Well, great, thanks for the introduction. Regards to all of you, wherever you may be. I'm very happy to meet you here in this virtual space, ladies, gentlemen. Do you know the book by Fatum of Keel Harper? Fatum by Keel Harper describes the demise of the Roman Empire, and the hypothesis is that the decisive factor which led to the demise of one of the largest world empires of the 500 years was not structural problems or the migration of societies. It was climate change in connection with a pandemic, which was reaching out from China to Portugal. That, I think, sounds like a very contemporary hypothesis, and that's what it is. Anthropogenic climate change is changing our world in an irreversible way. When at the beginning of the month, the Polar Star research ship came back to Bremerhaven after 1 year of research activities, the findings were quite shocking. Temperatures in Arctic are 10 degrees higher than 100 years ago, and where we had permafrost and eternal ice, there is now open sea. And it's not only the tip of the iceberg that is melting. The impact of climate change on all of that that is below the tip of the iceberg is something that we have not researched into. And all of that has major impacts regarding our life, our economy, nature, but also an impact on our cultural heritage. Today, we have to ask ourselves new questions: how to prevent the cultural heritage from being flooded once the sea level rise even more? What is the impact of higher temperatures on the substance of historic buildings? What are opportunities in digitalization in order to document our cultural heritage? All of these are questions that we should all feel concerned about. And the cultural sites are our common heritage, the common heritage of humankind. To protect them, to preserve them, this is our joint responsibility as a global community. And it is also in our best common interest to do so, because when we preserve cultural sites and cultural heritage, it's not only about questions regarding stability of states and entire regions. Cultural heritage also creates identity, joint identity, and therefore it's an integral component of our foreign relations, foreign policy, and it's getting more and more important. The question as to what the impact of climate change on the cultural heritage is therefore also a highly political topic, and it goes hand in hand with our foreign policy priorities. Climate change is now a crucial, a primordial topic of nearly all foreign relations. It's about questions relating to peace and global justice. And last but not least, it concerns questions regarding resources, prosperity, but also progress and innovation. And this is exactly the reason why sustainability does play a crucial, a central role in the reorientation of our foreign policy, educational and cultural heritage policy, which we are now developing in the scope of a strategy process. We're convinced that international cultural heritage policy needs to also make a contribution to achieving the sustainability goals of the United Nations. And as you know, the countdown has started, and it's possible to do so by having cultural and international exchange beyond borders. Therefore, it is also one of the pillars of our strategy process. Our science diplomacy, as we call it, needs to be extended. Our objective is to reach out to international scientists and researchers to get them together in order to promote scientific findings so that these findings can be taken as the ground for political decision making. Ground check 2020 is based on that. What's the impact of climate change on the cultural heritage? How has climate change changed culture and cultural heritage in the past? And what are solutions and political requirements that we need in order to protect our cultural heritage? And how can our knowledge about climate change and its impact be integrated into our societies and taken into the societies? These are not niche topics. They are rightly an important area of research and activity of the German Archaeological Institute, with a independent and specific domain. And that's good because the relations between humans and environment, to examine them in a long-term perspective, is not only of historic interest, it also creates the basis for using historic data and integrate them into decision making in order to be able to use them for preventive measures as well. Just to give you an example, if in certain regions of the world all the more frequently we have high precipitation levels or forest fires, this is also a threat for cultural heritage. Therefore, it's all the more important to be able to provide quick support. If every time we first have to build up structures and get experts together to respond, that takes too much time, and we can't accept that. How important it is to be rapid when it comes to threats, that's what we saw when we had the fire at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, but also recently in Beirut. Therefore, I'm convinced that our idea, our concept of a rescue mechanism for cultural heritage, I'm also a politician, and that's a term that my constituency can work with. That is getting more important in climate change and in the field of everything we have to face. You will be talking to members of the parliament, and I know that many of them are very committed and contribute to this project. And it's very important that the German Archaeological Institute makes quick headway in this field. I commit myself to supporting you. Don't find your program in the different strategies, but it needs to be integrated into legislation as well. Climate policy is not only environmental policy. Ladies and gentlemen, no one can tell us and say that climate change is not visible. Climate change has become a reality that we feel ever more strongly. Even the Romans in antiquity knew that climate is changing. Very often they had crop failures. Very often they had to cope with famine, and they lost in their power. The difference is that we are the ones that are responsible for climate change, but we can also do something to fight climate change. We need a joint force, a joint effort of the global community in order to mitigate the warming of the planet. And at the same time, we need to develop strategies that help us to mitigate the impact of climate change. Once the average temperature has increased by 2 or 3 degrees, it is already too late. Time is nearly up, and water is rising higher, which you clearly and literally see in Venice, for example. A gigantic rescue building has been erected in order to protect the ancient part of the city against floodwaters. But Venice is not only one example to show how the cultural heritage is threatened by the climate change impacts, but it also shows what international cooperation is about. In 1964, a charter on the protection of monuments was adopted, which outlines guidelines how to preserve our heritage. And this task was seen as a joint responsibility of humankind. And I think that joining forces in this very way is what we need. We need a common strategy, how to protect our cultural heritage in the times of climate change. We need a Charter of Venice 2.0. In our globalized world, at least, climate change requires strong multilateral responses and international solidarity. And this is why Germany, in a few weeks, in the scope of our EU Council presidency, invite stakeholders to the international conference on strategies how to protect cultural heritage. Ladies and gentlemen, we need international cooperation. We need well-based scientific exchange and the commitment of individuals, people like you. And here I would like to thank my colleagues from the subcommittee at the Federal German Parliament that work in this field. They have not joined the conference yet, but they will join later. It is very important to have a very close cooperation in this committee, and that was very good over the past years. It's always a pleasure for me to have an exchange with my colleagues from the subcommittee, but also with you, representatives of the German Archaeological Institutes and all other parties that are involved and highly committed. Thank you very much to all of the members of the Foreign Office, and I wish you a good conference. Well, Ms. Müntefering, thank you very much for your address, and not only the fact that you talked about the protection of cultural heritage, but also the importance of fundamental research in this field. The subcommittee is very important for international cultural and educational policy is very important. And now we change over to English.
We will look back on our 5 first ground check discussions, and we like to sum up the insights we've gained there. We start with the basics. How do we know about the past climate? How do we know about past influences on early societies? Michel Demise from the Freie Universität Berlin will present the insights of discussion number 1, from model to impact, reconstruction of past climate changes and their consequences. Please, Michel Demise.
Thank you very much for your words. And yes, now I am just trying to give a short impression what we discussed during the first session. We are all not archaeologists, but we are natural scientists. So the focus will lie more on the environmental things. So just to start, as everybody probably in the session, we discussed the global climate fluctuation that resulted in differing changes in different regions. So some region it dried up, in some region it got wetter, and people had to deal with these new environmental conditions. Yes, and we just go through shortly through the studies that we discussed during the session. And we can summarize it up on the words climate changes and societal responses, complex and large research field with no simple answers, neither today nor in the past. So the first presentation just showed extreme weather events and catastrophic events during the Middle Ages in central Germany. And here you can see how you can see what happened in the documents, in the sediments, and what was the triggered after these climate events, things like land cover changes, vegetation change, the land use changed. There was a malnutrition because of catastrophic events. They had diet changes and more. Then in a second short presentation, Detlef Kronebaum showed his model he developed. He put this model on the spread of the first farmers in southwestern Germany. And in his model, he saw that the most important thing in changes of the social cohesion of society was not the external climate change, but internal factors. However, he said that climate might enhance the social cohesion or the discohesion. Then Pavel Tarasov from the Freie Universität Berlin showed us an example of East Asia, where the monsoon is the most important climate maker. And there, about 3,000 years ago, the monsoon weakened, and there was a response, a direct response to this in the social societies. So before there were settled farmers making crop cultivation and husbandry, and then with the weakening of the monsoon, there was a change to nomadic pastoralism. And finally, we presented our project at the FU. It's called Degree. We are studying the aridization of the Sahara during the last 6,000 years. And our question was, what was the changes in the living there? And so we looked at the getting drier of the desert and what happened in the oases, the places where animals and peoples and men could refuge to. And we postulated that it may be a standardized response in the different oases, but we could see that this was not the case. We compared different oases and saw that though a general aridification took place, there were different patterns of crop cultivation that we could distinguish in the oasis. So you have oases with very early date palm cultivation and oases where this happened only very, very, very late. So you can see that there were differing answers to the same climate change. So, and now the dimension of these things, we can ask, what about the past for the future? And we discussed that though it's a unique future that we have to face today because of higher CO2 concentrations, higher climatic variability and higher temperatures, but we think that we nevertheless can learn from the past, or we can go to the past to get lessons for the future, because there are some clues that may be given. So Marchand and Lane, they said that societies have evolved and developed under continual climate change. So climate change ever happened. And then people had to develop resilience. And if we can understand the disconnection between the climate regime and how people live there and continue to live there, then we can learn to maximize the resilience living there. And this may be simple things like, for example, look at lost or forgotten crops. So in the Sahara, there were trees. Today, they are everywhere, the date palms. But in the past, there were trees such as the Sisyphus is shown here. In some remote and small oases, it is still cultivated, but it doesn't have an importance today. So, but it's very well adapted to the conditions. So we can learn from the past, perhaps to put these in more value again. And of course, we have the models we can reapply to the new data. And finally, what do we need for, as researchers, to stress or to answer or help to answer these questions? So the first thing is that we have really to have an integrated research with multiple disciplines together, archaeology, biology, geography, and so on. And we have to produce more reliable data. So we want to have much more long, high resolution details, records to reconstruct the climate, the vegetation change, and of course, archaeological excavation to put these together. So it's not only the long perspective from the material itself, but the research has to be the same for the long perspective. Okay, then thank you.
Thank you, Michelle Demise. This was the perspective of the natural scientists to try to reconstruct past climate niches which early societies had to deal with. Now we will focus on what were the responses of these societies. This was the subject of discussion number 2, impact of climate change on early cultures, case studies, and the results will be presented by Dr. Lee Clare. He's with the Istanbul department of the German Archaeological Institute. Please, Mr. Clare.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. As you mentioned, I'm going to be reporting on the second ground check meeting, which took place on the 30th of September. when we were looking at the, as you mentioned, the impact of climate change on early cultures. And the participants in that meeting were Andrea Kay from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, and Jörg Lindstetter, Maike Wagner, and myself from the German Archaeological Institute. And our case studies, you can see here, covered aspects of long-term relationships between climate, environment, populations, and land use, from a time period spanning the late Pleistocene and the Younger Dryas, so that's the 11th millennium BC, through the middle and early middle and up to the late Holocene, that's the 1st millennium BC, in different parts of the globe. So we had a focus on the Near East, that was my presentation, the Western Mediterranean, that was Jörg Lindstetter, East Asia was Maike Wagner, and Andrea Kay was looking at West Africa. Now, in our case studies, absolute chronologies, so radiocarbon dates and paleoclimate proxy data sets were important tools. Now, absolute radiocarbon ages allow us then to date changes in prehistoric material culture. And they also allow us to date, for example, transitions in subsistence practices. For example, transitions from hunter-gathering to small-scale farming to pastoralism. And at the same time, these radiocarbon dates are also needed to date, really, the paleoclimate records. And for this reason, the identification of any temporal correlations between climate, environment, population, and land use relies very much on the accuracy of this data. And our case studies feature different paleoclimate data sets. You can see a few at the bottom there, including Greenland ice cores, lake and sediment cores, marine cores, and tree ring data. And although we were using, or in my case, I was using global climate proxies because they're rather helpful, we argued that more local paleoclimate data are really essential for our investigations because they provide us with more detail about conditions in the catchments of our sites, the sites that we're investigating in our respective research areas. So what were the main lines of evidence for climate impact on early cultures, which we have from our respective study areas? And I think a common feature of all our studies were the temporal correlations of known climate impact events, so the impact events we see in the curves, the paleoclimate curves, and changes in prehistoric settlement patterns and transitions in subsistence practices. So as I say, from hunter-gathering to farming, from farming to pastoralism. And importantly, and this was also stressed on several occasions during the evening, we said that any temporal correlation between climate change and changes within human societies does not automatically imply a causal relationship. In other words, it doesn't always have to be in climate. We have to be careful here because, of course, we weren't there, we don't know. And it would be rather determinist to actually argue in this way, and sort of interpreting the data in this way. Now, a term that was frequently mentioned in our case studies was one which actually helped us to better understand the long-term cyclicity of climate and society in the past, is vulnerability. Here we have to differentiate, though, between vulnerability of human societies in the face of climate change on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, we have the vulnerability of the climate and the environment to anthropogenic impact. So not only does the climate influence us, but we, of course, can influence the climate. We also heard that the concept of vulnerability can be further differentiated, whereas biophysical vulnerability refers, for example, to risks presented by a drop in the availability of natural resources due to natural or even anthropogenic changes. So, a certain animal is no longer available, certain crops no longer grow. Social vulnerability tells us that disasters linked to climate change are also the product of social, political, and economic circumstances of affected societies. And I think I remember mentioning that we have, the haves and the have-nots. Social hierarchization can have an impact on how well you can cope with the challenges presented by climate change. We also heard that one of the main challenges faced by prehistoric societies in the face of climate change was how to lower their vulnerability. And from the long-term perspective, it appears that prehistoric societies mitigated vulnerability or lowered their vulnerability risk through innovation. And this included, for example, the adaptation of subsistence strategies, the abandonment of most severely affected landscapes, and increased levels of group mobility. And one very good example was the one presented by Maike Wagner, where she was looking at increased mobility, subsistent change in North and Western North China, where there was a transition to more mobile lifestyles, mounted pastoralism and warfare in the region in the Bronze Age. So in a final slide, I just want to summarize some of the points made in the discussion after our presentations. And these were more or less the take-home messages of our meeting those weeks back. So firstly, prehistoric societies were active and innovative in the face of challenges presented by climate change. They weren't just sitting there and taking it, they were actively doing something about it, be it conscious or unconscious. Climate was not needed as a trigger for many important innovations. So just because there's a climate change, it doesn't mean it will trigger something. And we saw, I think, in the example of Jörg Lindstetter, that adoption of food production in the Western Mediterranean was not correlating, for example, with climate change. Archaeological archives and paleoclimate proxies need to be checked point by point in order to ensure that correlations between climate and social change are correct. And of course, the more data we have, the more radiocarbon ages we have, the more paleoclimate data we have, the more archaeological data we have, the more exact we can actually talk about what was going on. It makes sense. Each climate event is different, with effects varying according to, for example, local topography. I mean, this is why we need the local proxies for our studies, because of course, a global signal can have different impacts or different effects in different regions according to the geography, the topography, etc. From a long-term perspective, it's possible to see not only the successes of different strategies implemented, but also the failures in the face of climate change. So, I mean, we have groups that disappeared and never appeared again, and we have, of course, the groups that actually, sailed their way through these climate change events. And in our past long-term perspective, we would suggest from our experience that increased diversity is essential to make modern societies more adaptable and resilient to short-term fluctuations in climate. We see this in the archaeological record that if you have a greater number of plants or animals that you rely on, then the risk or the vulnerability, you are less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So that was a perspective from our long-term studies of climate change and social change in prehistory.
Thank you, Dr. Clare. So we've talked about different aspects of climate change already, which happens to different societies in different places. But one common theme is really water scarcity, the lack of water. And this was discussed in more detail in the ground check discussion number 3, water management and desertification. And I now ask Dr. Arnulf Hausleiter from the German Archaeological Institute to present the findings of this discussion group.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Wildermuth. Good evening, everyone. So our session was quite a heterogeneous composition of members. So there were Professor Brigitte Schütt from Free University of Berlin, a geographer. There was Professor Michael Rode of the Prussian Castles and Garden Foundation, Berlin-Brandenburg. And then there were 2 archaeologists, Bernd Müller-Neuhoff and I myself. And for in order to focus, I decided to mainly concentrate in the, let's say, descriptive or synthesis part on the archaeological part of the session, whereas in the final part on what is basically the result or the benefit for the present and future, I integrate the results, of course, of the discussion of all the participants of the session. So archaeological research integrates the interdisciplinary multi-proxy study and reconstruction of past climate change. Next to a number of significant events, micro-regional studies are aimed at increasing high-resolution data sets, at the same time providing information on humans making a living in extreme environments. And we have seen a number of examples already before. In our session, we discussed case studies of ancient historic irrigation systems for agriculture in the Mediterranean, Western and South Asia. It became clear that the populations in charge were extremely flexible and innovative in adapting to climatic challenges and changes in arid environments. Detailed knowledge of environments and techniques play a significant role, as did trial and error in setting up these irrigation systems. Planning and risk management, as well as maintenance strategies, were part of this package, as some of these irrigation systems were in place and in function for centuries, if not millennia. Thus, even in areas where we would not expect cultivation today, irrigation systems of different scales have been built, most of them based on gravity. One of them lies in the eastern basalt desert of Jordan. Notably, these terraced gardens are all located in the direct vicinity of hill fort settlements. Their socio-political role within the basalt desert more than 5,000 years ago is still not resolved. We will come back to the social implication in setting up irrigation systems, and also regarding the reconstruction of complex societies in the ancient Near East. But also oases on the Arabian Peninsula were in need of irrigation devices to optimize the exploitations of the resources. Irrigation may have started more than 7,000 years ago and continued over the millennia. What about the social context of these early systems? Were these cities in the desert or urban oases? How were these systems conceived in terms of maintenance and management? Who was responsible? Archaeology, in particular in the Near East, provided a number of explanations, usually focusing on monocausal and rather abrupt developments. However, such unilinear theoretical models for the reconstruction of ancient societies don't apply anymore. Whereas for ancient Mesopotamia, irrigation had been considered a trigger for the development of social complexity, as a famous Oriental despoty as a model, but this is out of place. Different scenarios need to be considered. Next to hierarchic societies, you have to imagine also cooperative forms of social organization in charge of these systems. Equally, a chronologically uniform start of irrigation cannot be postulated. The global approach in the study of the extreme diversity of landscapes and environments contributed significantly to adopting a differentiated perspective in explaining and reconstructing the multi-layered social processes. A complex network of interdependencies has been identified, replacing a simplistic ecodeterminism. And this we all agreed on in our discussion. The different social systems needed to develop resilience to disturbances in order to guarantee the long-term survival of their systems. Balance and stability are essential for the functioning of such systems, and shortage of water can be a source of conflicts within and between societies. Ecological as well as social factors may have led to the abandonment of irrigation systems. Finally, we turn to the question of the lessons from the past. In fact, an interdisciplinary archaeology plays a significant role in unveiling long-term processes of adaptation, and the preceding speakers have illustrated that in detail. When addressing the question of the actual benefit, it became clear that this is not a field of schematic solutions. A simple transfer of past to present, especially with regard to irrigation, is out of question in a globalized world. On the other hand, present and future research and education projects need to adopt the local perspective in order to create an understanding for the value of this cultural heritage as part of identity. Thus, archaeology can be a bridge for not only raising awareness, but also for increasing the attention to present-day climatic changes and the need of sustainable strategies in using the limited resources of our planet. And this is why I showed these two maps, and you will see that the orange parts are basically expected to be characterized by a shortage of water in 30 years from now. And this is an increasing tendency. And that is why we have to create, to raise the awareness and to interact with societies we are working in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hausleiter, for this insights into the reactions of societies to water scarcity, which were not uniform, but very special, not only on the local ecosystem, but for the social structures as well. water scarcity is but one effect of climate change. Another one can be a surplus of water, which was discussed in the fourth round of ground check. Impact of climate change on cultural heritage, coastal risk and flooding. David Harkin is with us from the Historic Environment Scotland, and he has seen the effects of these coastal risks with his own eyes. Please tell us.
Hello there. Yeah, thank you for the introduction there. Delighted to be asked along tonight to give you a recap of the fourth discussion that we had as part of this ground check conference programme. So my name is David Harkin. I am the climate change scientist at Historic Environment Scotland. We were looking at the impact of climate change on cultural heritage in the coastal zone, so sort of trying to focus on coastal risk and flooding. Of course, sites in the coastal zone seem to be the sort of poster children for when we're talking about cultural heritage sites at risk from the impacts of climate change. And I think that's because you can really see and visualize the impacts of climate change on a coastal heritage site in quite a different way to how you can to other sites. So of course, coastal sites are susceptible to both the processes from the coastal and marine environment as well as the terrestrial land processes. The names of my fellow panelists are on the screen there, and I decided that what I would do for this particular intervention would be just to talk really about the conversation that we had after everyone's presentations, because it was a very fruitful discussion. And in summary and in recap, when I think back to the discussion we had, actually, I think you could break it down into sort of 4 key strands that we concentrated on. So we spoke a lot about how the physical risks of climate change on cultural heritage sites at the coasts are pretty well understood. You know, we know about sea level rise, coastal erosion, different impacts. So I'll go into a little bit more detail in future in a couple of slides on. We also spoke about how many of the tools that we need to understand risk to cultural heritage sites, they're either in development or they already exist. So there is stuff out there for people to use to help them understand how their heritage assets on the coast are at risk. We spoke about how there is no one size fits all approach to addressing that risk on cultural heritage sites on the coast. And each site really has its own such specific requirements that there'll be an adaptation solution that's more suitable for that site than perhaps at another site. And then, as I think every other presentation has mentioned so far, the need for the interdisciplinary discussion between archaeologists, engineers, the local community, and many, many, many more people is fundamental to addressing this, because these are solutions, these are issues that cannot be addressed by sort of one focused group of people. It needs a huge range of voices around the table. I just wanted to go into or tease out a couple of extra points for each of those 4 key things that I feel summarise the discussion we had. So the physical risks of climate change on cultural heritage sites, they are pretty well understood. So we know that things like coastal erosion, sea level rise, we know enhanced rates of decay to physical cultural assets. These processes, because they've always happened, we do know the sort of physicality behind them quite well. But of course, climate change takes stuff that we already know and pushes it into an unknown sphere. So of course, climate change makes things like coastal erosion worse. So understanding the sort of physical issue, we're quite well there already. We have a good evidence base that sort of pretty much just tells us that we need to take action. Many of the tools have been developed or in development that let caretakers understand risk to their coastal heritage assets. So the image you see here on the screen is from a project that was carried out by one of my fellow panelists, Lena Reinman. She led a team of people to assess the risk from coastal flooding to the World Heritage Sites in the Mediterranean Basin, so sites in the sort of coastal zone. So tools like this, as they're developed, they also develop methodologies that other people can then go on and use. And this project is one example of many out there that give people the tools to try and understand, or at least take those first steps into understanding the climate risk to their sites at the coast. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing the impacts of climate change on heritage assets at the coast. So we spoke about the recent in Venice, where they've installed the new flood defence system in the lagoon, and I think it had just been tested the week or two before our panel discussion successfully for the first time. So there are these large engineering solutions that can protect heritage sites and other aspects of society from the impacts of climate change. But the large, heavy engineering solutions are not going to be appropriate in most cases. In fact, there has to be quite open and frank discussions about what can be saved. And then the idea that not everything can be saved is also important. But of course, those discussions must be driven by a range of people as well as the local community. And that takes me on to the last point, just to mention again, is that the interdisciplinary nature of the discussions that have to happen is super important. And to me, it's not appropriate for someone in my position, for example, to go into a local community and tell them what should happen to something that belongs to them or something that is important to them. I think these discussions really have to start from that local community level. They have to be the people that decide what actually happens to the heritage assets in their environment, in their coastal zone. Because the example here that you see on the screen, this is a Neolithic monument in up in Orkney, and the local community at that particular site decided that the site was at such high risk and they didn't want to lose it, that they would actually dismantle it and rebuild it at their local community heritage centre further inland. So there are quite difficult questions that we have to answer as a sector around about the way we value heritage and the way we think it should be preserved for the future. And I think the example here highlights a direction of travel that we probably have to go down as a sector, where we are perhaps doing things that in the past we would never have considered doing, like dismantling a site, rebuilding it and moving it inland. And that is the end of my recap. And I hope if my fellow panelists are watching in, I've done justice to the conversation we had, because it was fascinating. It was super interesting.
Thank you, David Harkin. So we've learned again that these heritage sites are not only about their archaeological value, but the value for the communities that live there and see it as their personal heritage as well. So we've learned that coastal sea level rise might be a problem, but the defining feature of climate change, warming, is a threat as well. That was the topic of our fifth discussion, impact of climate change on cultural heritage warming, and the results will be presented by Henny Pizzonka of the University of Kiel. No, it's Sabine Reinhold. I'm sorry, I mix up. So it's Sabine Reinhold presenting these findings, and she's with the Deutsches Archaeological Institute. Please.
So in fact, we are presenting that together, and I will share my screen now with you. Let's see. So the high latitudes of Eurasia and America were in the focus of the fifth ground check discussion on warming. The panel included two scientists situated outside of the high latitudes, Henny Pizzonka in Kiel and me from the Eurasia department, who nevertheless work in the north in these areas, and two specialists, and I've also seen that they are watching, that actually live and work in this endangered area, Anne Jensen from Alaska and Martin Callanan from Norway. And while the first three speakers focused rather on the permafrost sites of the Arctic, of the high latitudes, Martin Callanan presented glacier archaeology and ice patch that likewise are endangered from melting and thawing. So the Arctic is and the mountain peaks are areas where we would not expect too much archaeological heritage. But as the presentations have shown, this heritage is present. It is there, and it is very, very vivid. It is very. It also includes a lot of very interesting, very spectacular finds, and it permits information on the life ways and also on the economic of the prehistoric people. For instance, the ice patches are usually located in hunting areas. So these areas, even they are rather remote from our European perspective, these areas can contribute very valuable information on the understanding of historical developments in a worldwide perspective. You see in on the slide some of the information that we can get from the Arctic or from frozen sites, which is not only important archaeological finds, but a lot of other aspects. And we can discuss these prehistoric lifeways, the ecosystems, but also the climate resilience of these people. We can discuss resilience strategies, but we can also discuss extinction bottlenecks. And these areas, beside a spectacular and beautiful, really beautiful findings, we can derive from the archaeological sites in the cryosphere, and that means the Arctic and the mountain glaciers, highly important information due to the fact that these objects are preserved, especially the organic objects are preserved under permafrost conditions. But the temperatures are rising, the sea ice extent is going down. That means these areas are threatened in manifold ways. They are threatened by rising temperatures, but the thawing of the melting of the sea ice leaves the coasts unprotected. And Anne Jensen from Alaska showed us some very dramatic images. What happens after a big storm? The sites are literally washed to the sea. So the rising temperatures irretrievably affect the Arctic and the glaciers. They are melting down the permafrost bodies, they are melting down the ice. When it's gone, it's gone. The sites are washed into the sea by coastal erosion in storms or in other erosions, also due to the fact that the compact nature of the soils by permafrost is diminishing. Other sites are decomposed to organic mush within 1 or 2 generations. In 10, maybe in 20 years, the upper right image would look like the lower parts, leaving only indifferent soil colors in the ground that indicate something was there once. And in fact, when we discussed the results or what was general in our discussion, it was that these processes are happening now. And it is nearly impossible to stop them. They're really going on. We cannot stop the processes that have already started. And as the state minister just now said, this temperature rise is present. So in the second part of the debate, we went into the question, what can we do? What let's say little can we do to preserve this highly important archaeological and cultural heritage? All of us agreed that the most important thing to do is to raise the awareness of the importance of the archaeological heritage in cryospheres, both in the Arctic and in high mountain areas. And in fact, the huge impact this can can be seen in the rocket-like push for alpine archaeology after discovery of the Iceman Ötzi in 1991. We can support the archaeologists working in these regions with own projects, with our scientific expertise, and most of all, with a better and a more quick funding. Again, part of the presentation by Anne Jensen was a report that her funding arrived, in fact, when the site already had vanished due to another storm. So better funding and quicker funding is certainly an important aspect. We can support the colleagues by presenting the important results of their work in exhibitions. One of them can at the moment be visited, not at the moment, but when traveling is possible again, in the British Museum. Another is scheduled for 2023 in Chemnitz. And you see some others on the screen that are going on in Stockholm, and one was in Frankfurt. Publications can reach out beyond the archaeological auditorium. Even the archaeological auditorium is very important. And we can help also to integrate indigenous perspectives into research agendas and exhibitions. That was a point raised basically by Henny Piazzonka. We can and we have to discuss the irreversible damage that rising temperatures and human impact in vulnerable areas such as the high latitudes and the high mountain peaks have. For instance, in a forum like this, in discussions with colleagues, but chiefly with people with a broader audience, with politicians, with fellow scientists that study these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabine Reinhold. You've mentioned the importance of funding. This is a question for the politicians, but they are still bound up in the Deutsche Bundestag because of an important vote they have to cast right now. They will join us shortly, but first a question to the panel of the experts. We've learned about the interactions of climate with past societies and their heritage, and that it's very specific to the situation and the society which has to respond to it. But are there nevertheless common themes in the reaction of people to challenges that are posed by rising temperatures, for example? Please join the discussion.
Common threats. I mean, I mentioned, of course, in the paper that I gave summarizing our results, that, of course, the threats in the past are the same as the threats as they are today. Obviously, as far as we know, the people in the past were not really taking care of what they considered to be the past. As far as we know, there weren't any archaeologists or conservationists, but I think the threats that we're experiencing today are very much the same. And as I mentioned, the vulnerability factor is something that we need to look at. And I think this is where we see the link between the past and the present. Just simply, I remember back to our discussion we had a few weeks back when I was saying I was quite pessimistic that we could perhaps lower our own vulnerability levels. Perhaps I shouldn't have been that pessimistic, but it's also to do with education. As we just heard in the last presentation, we have to be aware, make people aware of the impacts of climate change, not only to our own well-being, but also the well-being of our heritage. So yeah, I see parallels, of course, but of course, looking back to the distant past, the prehistoric period, and to today, there's a very big gap, of course.
I would ask the other scientists to join the discussion. So when we talk about the reaction to climate change, there are often technological solutions discussed, green ways of energy production, carbon capture and storage, and so on. But when you look back at how societies reacted, are social innovations as important? Dr. Hausleiter, you referred to the social organization of irrigation projects. So is the social and the technical has to go hand in hand?
Well, yes and no, and I try to point out that again, models which have been prevailing for many years are basically to be replaced by the results of local data and regional data, and that is, I think, shared by everyone, that we need an increasing amount of high resolution data in order to be able to explain better what happened. And try to show on my map, which was basically a palimpsest of the Near East, that we have a regional and local solution for technology and society. They go in a way hand in hand. On the other hand, again, there are local solutions. And what I wanted to add probably to what Dr. Claire said before, the use of technology in order to survive or to making a living is quite amazing. And I was always oscillating between pessimistic or optimistic, and sometimes looking back in the past, it is quite amazing to see how our ancestors, which have always been underestimated also by us archaeologists, how they survived and how they went on. On the other hand, the dimension of climate change today is quite different, even though there was also a global world in antiquity. So And it's very interesting to contrast these 2 points of view. But as Minister of State said before, the water is close to our neck, to translate it literally. This is certainly different from what the other people in the past were facing. So I think, yeah, it's a different situation today than thousands of years ago, but the problems, of course, were the same, and they were man-made.
What can archaeologists and natural scientists looking at the deep past bring to the table of modern climate discussions? Sabine Reinhold.
Yeah, I think many things have been said, and we do have, and it was mentioned in the first summary. We need a good and high resolution data to follow the developments, and that also helps us to predict the developments. So in fact, I think we would need both, as it was mentioned, a long time perspective, a scientific long time perspective that we can understand and that we also can monitor what is going on, and that we also will help us to understand what happened in the past in these areas. So the Arctic was settled during, let's say, the last 30,000 years, not continuously, but in times. And of course, these people live there. And if we understand today how they interact with their environment, so an ethnographic perspective, but likewise an archaeological perspective about how the situation was maybe 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, then we can understand how the resilience and what is possible to do in this area. So we would need, on one hand, a long-term perspective, a scientific long-term perspective, but we need certainly also a quick time, a quick possible response. So we would need, on one hand, the microscope and the driller to get the data, but we would need the helicopter to go there and help on the other hand as well. That is literally spoken, but that would be that is the 2 points that would maybe help us.
So many people are fascinated by ancient cultures, and they go on the travels when travel is again possible to see World Heritage sites, for example. So can this fascination with ancient cultures be a vehicle to motivate people into action against climate change when they see, okay, these sites are in danger, David Harkin?
Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there with that particular point about what archaeologists and what sort of more widely the cultural heritage sector can sort of bring to the climate action table. And I think it is the fact that when you consider World Heritage sites and other cultural heritage sites, we have a captive audience. People come to us for an experience about their past, and we have a unique ability to tell stories. And I think that the stories we tell should obviously be about the history of a place, but I think now it has to be about the future of a place as well. And and archaeologists and other cultural heritage professionals, we deal in time. That's the very nature of our job. And you look back into the past, and there's stuff that you can learn about how societies have adapted and evolved in the past that sort of rings true with the present, with the future as well. So yeah, I think we actually, as a sector, we sort of owe it. It's the thing that we must bring to the climate action table. So yes, if people are seeking us out for that. For that sort of experience, then we need to make sure that we're providing not just the historical context, but the future context for a site as well, and using them as communication and education tools.
Do the other members of the panel see this as a chance as well to use the interest of people in your research to really move climate change action forward? Dr. Claire, for example.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. I mean, of course, where I work in southeastern Turkey, it's a bit drier, and than some of the regions we're looking at just now. But of course, that is also a problem. And I also see down there more of a man-made problem itself in the use of irrigation water now down there, the large dams that are, of course, being built. And it's actually changing the climate in the region around Schandelhofer, where I'm working at Göbekli Tepe. You can actually see, whereas in the past, during the summer months, autumn months, the landscape around the site was brown and arid. And now it's green because, of course, they have much more water, and that is actually the evaporation of that water is also having an effect on the local environment. Now, it's unclear at the moment as to how that can affect our site itself. I mean, this is something we have to observe in the future, I think. But of course, there are new threats coming, and I think we have to keep an eye on those, and that's why it's very careful to monitor, I think, at these sites. Even sites that don't appear to be in danger, I think a monitoring is essential to just sort of get hold and grab and realize those new threats before they actually become a danger.
On some of the sites you mentioned, there's a very long social structure which was able to maintain technical solutions for irrigation. I think it came up in the discussion from Dr. Hausleiter. There are some of the irrigation systems, the society, the cultural structures behind them are running for hundreds of years. In Spain was one example. There was another one, I think, in Sri Lanka. So is there something we can learn about resilient social structures from these examples from the past?
Well, surely we can learn. I would also think of how we transmit this information to the societies exploiting the resources. And so I think it would be difficult to, let's say, convince people nowadays to use an ancient irrigation system. I mean, we have discussed it in detail on the historical irrigation systems being part of the local identity. But in many countries, fossil sources are being exploited, and one would have to deconstruct the whole development, let's say, to go back and then to explain the mechanisms behind. So I think education is a very important aspect. And I know that this is not really the answer to your question, but it's basically adding to what Lee Claire said before. So how to communicate between us archaeologists and the societies and local communities we are working with. And I think that's very important. So often an ancient irrigation system is meaningless. On the other hand, if we explain why it was put there and what were the effects, then it's important and becomes relevant because it's a tool and we can explain the situation and the current and future challenges. So that is what I wanted to add and to put into this discussion.
So this discussion is outreach as well, because there's not only scientists listening, but the politicians will soon join our discussion. So what do you as scientists expect from politicians in terms of archaeology and heritage? Maybe you can start, Michel Demise.
Yes, perhaps I may put another element to this thing, because we are always talking from archaeology and cultural heritage. But if we work together, we can see that perhaps we may much more focus on natural and cultural heritage put together. And this may be a big chance, because then really you have the living of the old people to show it there. And on the other hand, by such projects, you might, what I just mentioned a little bit before, sensibilize for things like lost crops, yes, because I think that's really something we can learn from the past. There's a lot of knowledge in old agricultural traditions and old plants that were cultivated that are, it's nearly gone today, yes? And I don't want to say that people have to cultivate all species again, or practice like they do it before 200 or 300 years, but there's a big potential, because there often take local plants that is a little bit forgotten that they put it. Yes, so at the oasis of Taima, you see always date palms, but if you go in other smaller oases, you see a great variety of other trees. And as mentioned before, this diversity may have a bigger chance in the past to survive, and now we forgot it. Yes, and often we lose the genetic pool of things like this. So I think this would be great for politics too, to invest more in research like this, yes, because it's a little bit a marginal research at the time, the lost or forgotten crops, and we could integrate it really in archaeology.
So this was asking for a more closer collaboration between the different fields to get a more richer perspective on the past. And I'm happy that I now can announce that our politicians from the Deutschen Bundestag have cast their vote, and they have found the time to join us here on the panel. And therefore, we will switch to German again. Wir wechseln wieder ins Deutsche. Die Groundcheck-Diskussion.
So we will continue in German, and the ground check discussions has shown how interesting this glance back into the history was, and how interesting this can be in terms of climate change, and how interesting it can be to see what the processes in the past were like. And at the same time, the remains from this history are also endangered. Now we will change our perspective. We will now come to the perspective of politics. And for that, I welcome some members of the German parliament who all are members of the subcommittee on cultural relations and educational policy. And this subcommittee is also in charge of the German Archaeological Institute. Claudia Roth is the vice president of the German Bundestag and party representative in the subcommittee on cultural relations, educational policy. Then there is Dr. Barbara Hendricks from the Social Democratic Party. Many of you will remember her as the former Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Construction and Nuclear Safety. And in this function, she was part of the negotiations for the Paris Climate Agreement. And the third member of the German Bundestag is Mr. Thomas Erndl from the Christian Socialists. He is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Cultural Relations and Educational Policy. And finally, I also would like to welcome Professor Friederike Fless, who is the president of the German Archaeological Institute. And she is one of those who launched this research project, Ground Check. And so I'm very pleased that all of you are here today, despite all the other things you have to do at the moment. In the ground check discussions, we spoke a lot about the risks for the cultural heritage, rising sea levels. And if you think of the castles in Scotland, the temples in the Mediterranean, or the sculptures in the Easter Island, they are all at risk because of the rising sea levels. So what other aspects or what other areas are you familiar with where such risks exist? Yeah, I'm very happy that we can still be part of this very important discussion, even if we are a little late. And maybe one day we will be able again to see this in life, and we can meet again. I think this is a very important topic, and it is a big challenge for us. We realize that the situation becomes more and more dramatic. When I think of the huge fires, the apocalyptic fires in the United States, or let me remind you of the flooding in East Africa, where whole regions were flooded, where millions of people had to leave the areas because it was not possible to live there anymore, and we hardly spoke about it here in Europe. And let me remind you of the thawing of the permafrost. And something that struck me particularly was a trip last year when I went to Bangladesh and Pacific Islands. And during this trip, I understood in a more emotional way what it actually means when whole regions just disappear. If you think of Bangladesh, 30% of the built land, the people there, 35 million people live in coastal regions that are at risk. And every day, 2,000 people leave or have to leave their villages that are flooded, churches that just disappear in the water. And these people go to the capital city, and living there is like in hell. The environmental conditions are catastrophic. Air quality is extremely bad. I was in the third biggest city of Bangladesh, the city of Khulna. Over the past 5 years, 500,000 people came there. There are numerous slums. I'm sorry.
So, also die Stadt.
So the city has 1.5 million inhabitants, and 500,000 had the opportunity to talk to many of these people, and they are class refugees. They lost their home and have to live now in the slums and don't have any perspective for the future. And we were in some of the big mangrove forests. It's world natural heritage. And as has been said, you have to combine natural and cultural heritage. And then it becomes very clear this world heritage, these large mangrove forests are a natural protection against the big cyclones in the coastal areas. And every day they are dying because they need water, and the water becomes more and more salty, so they will disappear. And this means that not just a protection against the cyclones will disappear, not only a natural heritage will disappear, much diversity, all the birds, the fishes that live there. And so we had the to visit the Pacific island Kiribati, and when you get there, you see it from above and you think that this is paradise, but it is not paradise. It's an atoll country, and the highest part above the sea is 2 meters above sea level. The older people told me that during their childhood, once a year, there was the big flood that the island flood, and now it comes per month, not once per year. And so it is very likely that this state will not be able to survive. And so people ask, what will happen to us? What will happen to our graves, to our churches? I mean, it's a big tragedy that they do not know what will happen to their dead. And so this is a topic that we will have to think about. We will have to talk about this, because for those who will lose their country, like Kiribati, like Tuvalu, like other countries, and in some decades from now, it might be Bangladesh. It's millions of people who are affected by this. They will lose their state, their country. What will happen with those people? And if you don't believe the Green Party, then you might believe the World Bank, who also says that already 30 million people have lost their home, have lost their cultural sites. And so it became very clear to me that it is not just a country, not just a nature which disappears, it's also a language that disappears, it's a whole culture that disappears. And So you cannot tell people that this can be stopped. And so for me, this was a very moving, very touching experience, the most touching experience I ever made in my life. Because these are the people who are not responsible for it. The farmer from Kiribati is not responsible for what happens. He's not responsible for the fact that his country is going to disappear.
Well, thank you very much. This is actually the aspect of the cultural heritage that is threatened by climate change. It's an aspect that we don't hear about that often. Barbara Hendricks, you have been involved in many of that climate negotiations. Does the protection of cultural heritage does play a role when we talk about CO2 levels that need to be lowered? Are politicians aware of that? Are they aware of the cultural aspects related to climate change? Well, to be honest, too little. We need to be honest and outspoken about that. It's perceived too little. And even the United Nations, with their different tasks, is sort of working in silos. What UNESCO realizes is seen by the UNCCD, the World Climate Secretariat, is not perceived in the same way. And not within the United Nations, we have the exchange that would be necessary. Well, the loss of cultural heritage does play a role in so far during the climate negotiations. I mean, that we talk about the loss and damages and negotiate about that. As a result of climate change, the loss that has been caused, we negotiate how to handle that, how to deal with that, how the countries of the North can compensate financially for that loss and supply funds to the countries of the South so that the loss and damages that do exist already are compensated for, offset for. And of course, we do have losses of cultural heritage that we have evidence of, and that refers to structural heritage, the architectural heritage, and that does not even mention the loss of language or tombs or cemeteries that were mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Wood. So in that context, yeah, it's also about that, but it does not play really a primordial role. It's a subordinate role that it plays. It is not really in the focus of our negotiations. Just very, very little attention is given to that aspect in the scope of loss and damages that I just mentioned. Thomas Ernl, as a foreign politician, you travel a lot, or you used to travel before coronavirus made it very difficult to go on a journey. As a result of your traveling, have you already experienced the impact of climate change for cultural experience? And what can the subcommittee contribute in terms of support, with the exception of your different tasks? Well, I have not been a member of the parliament as long as my two colleagues, so I haven't been able to travel that much. Well, I've been involved in some of the journeys, of course, and we went to Brazil with the subcommittee, and of course we have seen the impact of climate change. And if Corona had not forced us to cancel all our trips in May or June this year, I would have traveled to Africa for the first time, yeah, together with my colleague. We would have even met somewhere in Africa, because I am the rapporteur for Eastern Africa. And if you then look into Sudan or Ethiopia, that's what I learned when preparing for the trip, then you see the result, the impact of climate change very quickly. In Eastern Africa, we had the plague with the locusts and the conditions on site. Well, you then feel it, you see it, you perceive what climate change actually entails. That's a threat to the cultural heritage and treasures of these countries, and where the German Archaeological Institute is involved in order to help protect them. The threats, well, we have to counteract them, because cultural heritage is not just objects or buildings that you find somewhere, but they are very important for the cultural identity of the people living in these regions. They have a high importance for individuals living there. And if we have the possibility to preserve them while they are threatened by external influences, we need to do so. And we need to ensure our contribution to also guarantee stability in these regions. And therefore, it's decisive that we make available the necessary funds to do that, and the subcommittee that we are members of is best positioned to make a contribution and to tackle these questions. And I think with the German Archaeological Institute, we have been able to achieve quite a lot. The concept, the idea of the container to preserve cultural goods, that is a new project, or in the scope of the existing projects, we have been quite successful. It works very well. That's our task, our responsibility. And we, of course, observe very closely what you're doing. And it is excellent to see what you achieve, Professor Fless. That is the reason why we support you. And in the past, we have been quite successful. Thank you very much, Professor Friederike Fless. We have just heard during the different discussions and debates regarding early societies, how actively they responded to the changes and how the heritage of these societies is now threatened. In what way do you want to take up the results of the ground check discussions on the side of the German Archaeological Institute and further develop them or help use them? Well, let me start with the following. The idea to organize ground check was initiated by the simulations that we do regarding global climate changes. We have climate models, but these climate models have different impact in different places, and that makes it so difficult for people to understand them. In one part of the world, we have too much water, we have floods. On the other side of the planet, we have too little water. And in archaeology, when looking back into the past, we are confronted with similar events or changes. We see the big changes in local areas and in larger regions. And here we try to do that ground check to analyze what we can do to generate high resolution data to better understand how early climate changes and the local impacts are interrelated, but also to use the available data. And we've got a lot of treasures here. How can we make them available for current climate models and climate simulations? That's great. And our colleagues also contribute to the fundamental research that is fantastic with the course, Bohr course that they use. Well, how did the early societies respond to climate change? That's fascinating to see. Partly they have withdrawn in order to survive. Other societies, other people have shown a great deal of capability to adapt to the changes, and they used innovation in order to survive. For example, sustainable water management. And these changes, these adaptation mechanisms have partly been so intelligent, so smart, the plans that were selected, that we could actually reactivate them, and the knowledge can be used, knowledge that it can help us to build up sustainable structures. And the third point that we're interested in ground check and where we want to do some further development is, what is the impact on our current cultural heritage? What are the impacts?
Waren die Bilder ja wirklich
and here the images were dramatic for some regions where we need to say, well, it's already 12:05. The archaeologists try to sort of rescue what is still able to be rescued after permafrost has already melted, and to document things that have already half disappeared. And there was a image from our colleague from Alaska. She said, well, the funds were made available. We had asked for funds, but time was up already. The heritage was lost. We were too slow. And here we need to bundle our forces internationally in order to really take action and to be at least able to document things jointly, but to make a contribution also with regard to the current challenges, the current requirements, and also with regard to the simulations to generate data. Well, what can the policymakers contribute or do when it's about accelerating the speed, when we see that archaeological sites are threatened, where within 1 year sometimes the situation changes completely. A site is discovered and disappears at the same time. So this is no longer in line with the long-term funding perspectives that we are familiar with for long-term projects. Do you think that we could have special funding, immediate response funding that could be used, Mrs. Roth? Well, I would turn it around actually. What can archaeology do so that policy making is changing? I can give you an example here. It was quite remarkable. For a number of years already, I have been organizing a sort of round table on that topic, and I wanted to get people around that table that are sort of crossover, that do not necessarily talk about climate change funding, the Paris Climate Agreement, SDGs, etc. The fact that Mrs. Hendrick mentioned loss and damage. So I invited representatives of the churches, of course, of the science community. From Potsdam, we had representatives. Then the German Development Institute at the time with Dirk Messmer, refugee organizations, pro-asyl, NGOs, Brot für die Welt, the Goethe Institute, because the Goethe Institute has done a lot of research work on the climate crisis. And I invited the German Archaeological Institute. And well, the question came back from the Institute, but why us? And that was incredibly interesting because their contribution was in a very soberly, well-documented manner. And why? What actually happens? What is gone when we see the temperature rising by 1 degree, by 2, 3, 4 degrees? It was presented in a very cool way, and then all of a sudden you see something else. It's a sort of mobilization that happens, and while people tend to say then, my God, what are we losing in terms of world cultural, global cultural, our heritage? What do we lose? And so that sort of gave a lot of drive to others then to speak up and say, well, we need to be even stronger and take even stronger action. Well, what is it, what we can do in order to counteract climate change, to increase funding? And what Professor Fles said, adaptation measures, resilience needs to be built up. We need to really increase resilience, but also to say, well, what can we learn from that? How can we change our way of life or our way to be active in business, in economy? Risk insurance, for example, do play a major role. Then climate lawsuits, or lawsuits on ground of climate changes. And we need to say that the democratic parliamentary groups in our committee have always fought for that. Ms. Hendricks, Mr. Erndl, my parliamentary group, they have always fought for that the German Archaeological Institute can become more active, can become stronger in this area and take even more action. And we have been quite successful here in at least keeping the budget at the same level, and wherever it makes sense and is necessary, we have added additional funds to that. But that crossover aspect is very important, to get people together out of their silos and make them talk to one another, to share knowledge and competence and findings in order to increase the pressure, in order to make sure that even in times of pandemics, or particularly in times of pandemic, it is not a time to sort of push the climate crisis away and concentrate on the pandemic only, as if the pandemic would just come to a halt, or the climate crisis would come to a halt, so that in times of SARS-CoV-2, we do not all of a sudden feel another sort of pandemic within us, which is called nationalisms, that we focus only on what happens directly in our backyard and don't see anymore and don't perceive anymore that when an entire country disappears, or very important cultural sites disappear, or world cultural heritage gets lost, that this is also something that affects us and something that we lose. Well, this is also another buzzword, a key term, the contribution that can be made by science, international cooperation. Mrs. Hendricks, is that something where you as a politician, you use scientific research and archaeology in that sort of scientific diplomacy, that via science you can build bridges? Well, this is certainly the case.
well, especially the German Archaeological Institute, has this scientific approach. And this is very important, and therefore the German Archaeological Institute in itself is important. And I believe that we can build bridges, and this is also being done. I'm sure that the German Archaeological Institute has a good reputation worldwide, wherever it is active or was active, and in some regions where apart from it there is no communication going on. That sometimes happens in national or international context, that there's a kind of speechlessness. And luckily, in such cases, an institution like the German Archaeological Institute, who could use decades to build trust, has a possibility to overcome this speechlessness, this lack of communication. And this institute normally can stay in the regions and continue their work. Today also virtually talk to colleagues, to other experts. And I think this is a means to overcome the speechlessness, which has an impact beyond the scientific community into politics, into society in a positive way. And now the question to Mr. Thomas Erndl. This subcommittee is also responsible for funding the cultural cooperation of Germany. Do you see a possibility that not just Germany, but also the international level takes more action to at least document endangered cultural assets? Well, your microphone is not switched on. Sorry. Yes, of course. I believe that we have the capacities, that we have the means to do it. We have the expertise. Also, because of the accident at the City Archive in Cologne, we have this experience. And the National Museum in Bavaria. And so we have experience in rescuing cultural heritage, which is at risk. And on the other hand, we cooperate with other institutions like the THW, who have logistic knowledge, who know how to get the help to those who need it. And so we should join forces, use the expertise and experience of all our partners in order to protect and save the cultural assets. And I think that this is a very important skill that we can contribute and that we can make available to the international community. And I'm also convinced that we need these little pieces that we can put together in order to contribute to stability. Well, and whenever we can make a contribution to prevent things from being destroyed, then this is also a contribution to stabilization. And so we should continue this, even though it might be difficult in the time to come. It will be a struggle to get the funds, but the subcommittee is in a good position to get things done. Maybe I could add something to that. In the budgetary negotiations for the years 2021, 2022, we have to talk to the people of the budgetary committee, but I think that we have a possibility to achieve our objectives, and I think that this cooperation also with the other institutions, that this is something which is really good with the THW, so which is an institution that has a lot of technical means in disaster response, for instance, but they are also able to make the logistical side available. And so it was not a matter of course that they would accept to cooperate, but they were really interested from the very start to become a part in this project. And so I think we should also talk to those of our colleagues who have a focus on domestic politics. And so I think we can receive the funds we need for the year 2021-2022. So I would like to come back to the question that was asked to us, what we as archaeologists, as scientists can contribute to politics, to designing politics. And I believe that one contribution that we can make that has been mentioned in some of the presentations, that we can make things visible, that we can tell stories, that we can give examples for the past, things that show over a longer period of time how things work. And so this can also mean that we understand better what happens to our own landscape. We had very fascinating presentations on Western Africa, on the overexploitation of forests, when it was not possible to live there anymore because people had destroyed the basis of their own livelihood. I think these are things that we can make understandable. And our colleague from Scotland showed very clearly that their archaeologists mobilize the population on site, the local population, to take things in their own hands and to make sure that their own cultural heritage is preserved. So I think that the topics that we are talking about at the moment have a dimension, be it climate change, be it the pandemic, that we all have our part to contribute to it. And archaeologists can become active on site. And I mean, we have this pragmatic approach and we have these pragmatic cooperations. And so we can do something on site, and in doing so, we can mobilize people. And scientists also, because we talk differently, we create different contexts. We talk in our own expert languages, of course, but we also organize exhibitions, and so we can make the links understandable, because I think many people have not yet understood why the effects of the climate change are so different, and why in some cases this can be catastrophic, even though for us it is first of all a nice summer with nice sunshine, high temperatures. And in some regions, even of Germany, the water is scarce. And so what we heard about Jordan in the ground check conference makes that understandable, that in Jordan, over a long period of time, situation was really good. Big dams were constructed in order to collect rainwater, and then relatively little change is enough so that all this cannot be used anymore, that people cannot live there anymore. And so to make this visible and to raise awareness for these topics, so that we need to make sure that we do not reach this tilting point in our own societies. I think this is something that archaeologists can do by telling the story for over several thousands of years. So just as a little answer to the question what we can contribute. And you as politicians, what kind of questions would you like to ask to the archaeologists? What would you like to know? What would be the responses that you need not just for archaeology in itself, but answers that would help you in your discussions in the Parliament. May I start? Yeah, 3 questions. One thing that I'm thinking about a lot in our subcommittee and other committees, I believe that we live in a time where democracy has to struggle against authoritarian ideas. We are in the middle of a battle for democracy, which has to prove that it can get to terms with situations of crisis, like, for instance, the pandemic at the moment. And on the other side, we have the totalitarian ideas. And in this context, there is massive pressure, and there are limitations of freedoms, freedom of science, of research as well. And my question to archaeologists would be, do you experience this when you talk to your international colleagues, that there is more pressure, more limitations for your work? When I think of Brazil, for instance, when I think of Mr. Trump and his scientific politics, when I think of Russia, of China, there are a lot of limitations, often connected to people who do not believe in the climate crisis. So this is my first question. Then the second question, what is the biggest enemy to the biggest threat to the cultural heritage? There are wars, there is the climate crisis, there are destructions by Islamist terrorists. So from your point of view, what is the biggest enemy for cultural heritage? And my third question would be, what do you expect from us? What do we as politicians have to do in order to support your work? And what do we have to do in order to guarantee the freedom you need for your work? And the other politicians, do you have any other questions? Well, maybe one thing to add. The questions that my colleague Ms. Roth asked are the most important questions, but one more from my side. What about the looting of excavation sites? Is this still a problem? Is there a market for such looted assets? And is there anything we can do in order to regulate the markets and to eliminate a market for looted art, looted objects, artifacts of excavations? And I also would like to add something. What is the transfer between the different disciplines, scientific disciplines, and also society, when it comes to the results, to the findings, that there were settlements in the past that at some point in time had to be given up, or that a long time ago already had to respond to climate changes. And so society, I mean, there are these changes in the world, they are happening. And the question is how we can use this knowledge, how we can make sure that there is a knowledge transfer so that we are better equipped to get to terms with these changes. Well, research today is always research of different disciplines. Climate change and archaeology of early cultures is a very complex topic. It's not archaeologists alone. There are scientists of different disciplines who are involved in it. And together we can draw pictures and also say something about what was the biggest enemy in the past. In the end of the day, it's the human being with its their interventions but it's also the human beings who preserve the heritage, the assets, and that makes it very difficult to say what the biggest enemy is. One factor is tourism. You shouldn't underestimate that. There are more and more damages caused by people who take pictures, selfies, who post their photographs on Instagram. They climb on everything. They destruct a lot of things. Hadrian's Wall is very much at risk since Game of Thrones. And so depending on the regions, there are a lot of factors that come together. There is this lack of respect, and sometimes it can also be infrastructure measures, like for instance in mining industry, but this differs a lot between the individual regions. But it's human interventions which lead to a loss of assets. And that's also the case in excavations, and that continues also in Germany. It's not a phenomenon which is limited to regions of crisis, where the state is limited in its powers, but looting of excavations takes place everywhere. In Africa, it's very widespread. In Vietnam, it's extremely widespread. There it functions almost like mining claims which are sold to other people. And this brings us to the question of these systems that, and it's not easy for us archaeologists to find answers. Of course, there are limitations to our work in some regimes, but on the other hand, when we look back to our own past, be it the First World War or the Second World War, the scientific community is extremely resilient. The scientific networks are extremely resilient. So even if in one's own country there are difficulties, we can still continue to use these networks, and we can help our colleagues from the outside and can support our colleagues. And the politics, of course, also offers a possibility to create these spaces, even though sometimes this is conflictual. But in the context of the UNESCO, for instance, we can talk to each other. There are these multilateral spaces where we can communicate with one another. And of course, we need politics to understand the real problems so that we can support our colleagues. Sometimes it's good if politics is not involved, if we can work under the radar, so to speak, but sometimes it's also good to be visible. And so I think this is what we need, what we expect, that sometimes we can just do our work without being disturbed, even if there are difficulties on the international level, so that we can still continue to work. But sometimes it's also good, especially when it comes to very complex topics like looting of excavations, that these topics are talked about on the political agenda, because otherwise no one feels concerned of it. And so if no one talks about suppression of scientific work, then no one will think about it. So of course we try to maintain our contact and to continue our work. So Thomas Erndl, so this, what can you do to open up this and to preserve this space for the work of the scientists? Of course we do this. This is our job, to guarantee these rooms, these free rooms for the scientists. there is, for instance, also the Philip Schwarz initiative that was initiated a few years ago to achieve this. And there we are always capable of using our scholarships. If, for instance, researchers seems to be in danger in other countries, we can use these means like scholarships, but we make the money available. What is done with this money is something that the scientists decide themselves. Of course, subject to the regulations, but we do not interfere in this.
What is so important, I would like to come back to the incredible thing that political support by archaeologists. I would like to give 2 examples. This subcommittee has existed for quite a while, and I have been a member for quite a long time. And in times when Dr. Peter Gauweiler was still the chairman of the subcommittee, we had organized a highly disputed trip to Iran with the support of the former foreign minister or the members of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said, well, we have no bridges, we have hardly any contacts there. It's very difficult to enter into political dialogue. Maybe it would be a possibility to use cultural exchange or to try relaunch the cultural exchange and build bridges by doing that, not least with those people in Iran that are not on the side of the regime. And that was very difficult, very complicated, because, well, the Goethe Institute was no longer allowed to work and be in Iran, but it worked out fine because we had one member, a member of staff that was with us, an archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute. She served as a door opener. She opened doors towards the Minister of Cultural Affairs to archaeologists from Iran. They were very happy and grateful and thanked us and said, well, good thing do you hear that you try to open doors again to get back into a discussion, enter into a debate. It was a tiny, tiny, tiny contribution. We all know what the situation in Iran is like, but it was an attempt to use that topic of archaeology, our joint approach to these cultural topics, the work that had been done over decades, to take that as a point of departure to show people in Iran that we don't leave them alone with this terrible regime. And the second positive example that I would like to cite here, in really hard and violent times, I went to Baghdad. At the time, President Talabani was still alive, and it was a very moving visit to this huge archaeological museum in Baghdad, where we were shown how many decades, a long time ago, based on German funds, German support, help was organized to create something like identity by organizing an exhibition. If nothing was really capable of creating a common identity where the Sunnis were against the Shiites, the Kurds against everybody else, that was all of a sudden a venue, a place where it was visible and it was said that this is our common history, this is our common heritage. And again, we were thanked for the German support and the request not to be forgotten, not to forget that this museum, that place, should be seen as a linkage between the different cultures. I have no idea whether the museum is open right now. It was a few years ago, but this has made it very clear what force, also political, societal force, archaeology may have, and the great archaeologists from the German Archaeological Institute can contribute to that. Thank you very much. Well, this is a very nice final remark at the end of our debate, Ground Check 2020. We have really covered a very broad spectrum of things, and there was an aspect that comes back to what Mrs. Roth said, the question how democracies can maintain to exist in this world. It was about irrigation systems, where for a long time we've always discussed it, well, irrigation systems were built up only once we had hierarchical societies that were able to organize that, and it was a top-down approach to impose on everybody to get involved and to share water. But the new results of our research, which were presented in one of our ground check discussions, tell us that this was not the case for all regions. There was a wide range of different possibilities and a lot of diversity, and there were also cooperative societies that were not hierarchically structured, that over hundreds of years have made it possible to use and maintain these irrigation systems in very difficult landscapes and environments. So that is where archaeology can go far back into the past and show that different systems were successful, that it means to really deal with challenges not only in the basis of technical ideas. We do not only see breakthroughs based on technology or innovation, but it's also very important how to embed that in the social context, how to make it work, how to make it function, and that all of these different historic sites that we know are crucial in creating identity, shaping identity of the populations that live in these regions, or for our identity as global citizens. And that in view of climate change, this may also be an opportunity to get people's commitment to work and work hard and save their cultural heritage, but also have influence when it comes to fighting back climate change. That for the cultures at the time was a challenge, but it's even more so for us today, because it takes place in different dimensions, different time windows, much faster than climate change that the ancient cultures were exposed to. Therefore, I would like to thank all of you very cordially once more on the political side, the panelists and those who have supported our project. But I would like to also thank all the scientists that in our ground check discussions have presented their findings, their results, have shared their views and insights with us. And that was sometimes surprising for people that are not really familiar with archaeology, but they were very inspiring. And it was good to see how similar the ancient cultures are with us, the individuals of our contemporary time. And therefore, I wish all of us that this research work is continued, that the findings are taken up, and that they have an impact beyond the sphere of archaeology. They impact policy making and in society as such. Well, thank you very much to all of you. Have a nice evening. Stay safe at home, I hope, or get back home. We're still in the federal German parliament, so, and stay in good health. Thank you to everyone.